Well, hello and welcome to Chief Jones. We are so glad to have you as a part of this conversation this evening. Montgomery County Police Department has been a terrific partner with Montgomery College over this last several years, and I have been so grateful for the relationships that we've cultivated during that time. I know that you have a very large job, Chief Jones. Chief Jones leads one of the largest police departments in Maryland, with 1,300 sworn officers and 700 support personnel. He's coming up on his first anniversary as chief of police in Montgomery County in November, having served 35 years in the department. He brings with him experience as the Assistant Chief of Investigative Services Bureau and Commander of the 3rd District, Director of Major Crimes, Drug Enforcement. Chief Jones currently serves on the Maryland Violence Intervention and Prevention Advisory Council, and he formerly served as a board member of the Montgomery County Domestic Violence Coordinating Council. Diversity training for police is one of his areas of expertise. In fact, he helped launch an award winning training program, which he's delivered for numerous academy classes. He is also an adjunct faculty member for the Leadership in Police Organization's 3-week training course sponsored by the International Association of Chiefs of Police. He is a former national chairman of the National Black Police Association, where he held several other leadership positions. Now, Chief Jones holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from the University of Maryland, University College, and he is also a member of the Major Cities Chiefs Association, Maryland Chiefs Association, the Police Executive Research Forum, and the International Association Chiefs of Police. What a wealth of experience, and how fortunate we are to have him serving Montgomery County. You've worn so many hats, Chief Jones, and I'm sure all of them inform your current leadership of our department here. Now, for our audience tonight, I just want to mention a few of the partnerships that the college has had with the police over the last several years. We've collaborated closely with them on planning for large scale emergencies, and we've sought the guidance on a number of occasions, and in particular in the wake of shootings at Umpqua Community College in Oregon. We relied on recommendations of their security and safety experts in keeping our campuses safe. And we have a very robust criminal justice program here at the college. So I know that some of our graduates end up in law enforcement here. We've recently hosted 911 operator training through our Workforce Development Division because we learned that this is an area of critical need in the county. And one of our newest faculty members is Captain Sonia Pruitt, former captain in the department, who is well known nationally for her work as the former chair of the National Black Police Association. Now, I could go on, but I realize that most of our audience is joining us to hear about policing and how it's changing. I'll be incorporating some of the audience questions that came in addition to some of my own, because due to Zoom technology and other platforms, that we are potentially having a very large virtual audience. We've asked folks to send their questions in ahead of time so that we can record this. So I'm going to capture some of those voices in this discussion. And I want to thank all of you who sent in questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Now, Chief Jones, I probably don't need to say this to you. You, of all people, know this, that this past year has been very painful in many communities in terms of relationships with police. And we're going to get to that in a moment. I want to approach that, though, really with an opportunity for you to share. A lot of people know, and I gave you this very illustrious experience set that you have, but as someone who has served in this role for many years and being a police officer, what drew you to policing? Why did you want to become a police officer?
So thank you, Dr. Pollard, and good evening. I really appreciate the opportunity to share, and I appreciate Montgomery College's partnership and presenting this platform to really have this is very important discussion on policing. So what drew me to this profession? First and foremost, I have family members. My father was a Baltimore City deputy sheriff. And I just remember watching as I was growing up to see his connection with the community, even during his role while he was working, as well as his sort of his status in the community and how he worked well within the community to talk about law enforcement and assist people who didn't necessarily have access, but he was really a groundbreaker in Baltimore City during the late 60s and all throughout his career. So he was sort of like my first initial, that brought me into the profession. And then my brother, my oldest brother, who actually went to Morgan State University in Baltimore as well, he actually came to Montgomery County in 1983. And I was at the time just entering college in Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond at the time. And my brother brought me up a couple of times, and I did ride-alongs here in Montgomery County, and I was really intrigued by the sort of the work and the excitement of the job to some degree. And my brother talked me into joining, and it's a decision I have never regretted. I really thought when I came here, it was an opportunity to be a great part of this community, and I have cherished every moment of it ever since I've started here.
I think that says a lot to understand what drew you to the work community. This idea of a family history and a background in this space definitely responds to that. And I think then you must have great pride in the work of what your area does in keeping our community safe, of being servants of the community. And maybe I'll start a line of questions asking you about the department. What are you most proud of when you think about your department? And has there been any specific innovation in the Montgomery County Police Department which addresses some of the problems that you see happening that have been raised by civilians locally and certainly across the nation?
Yeah, so one of the things I think there are lots of things for me to be proud of this police department. I will tell you, I think that I am proud of the men and women who work here, both the sworn police officers and our professional staff, in order to do the work that is required to keep our community safe. And I will tell you, I think that they just do a phenomenal job on a day in and day out basis, regardless of what is sometimes the what might be going on across the nation or even in our own community. Because at the end of the day, it takes courage, it takes commitment, and really hard work to make sure that we are doing the mission which we have been tasked by our community to do, and it's not easy. But I will say I'm very proud of them. And when I look at our department across, and we are nationally recognized in many facets of our profession, and I think that speaks volumes. This year, we were just accredited for the ninth consecutive time and given the highest ranking for accreditation. So that shows me that we are still continuously doing the work. We really take pride in the fact that any complaint that comes into our department is documented, and we take all complaints seriously, and our those complaints come into our internal affairs division, and it is then decided upon by the internal affairs director of the seriousness of that nature of that complaint. And if it is a very serious complaint, it is giving the utmost amount of investigative responsibility, as we take it as what we call a formal investigation, where it is investigated by the internal affairs division investigator. Whereas if it is a minor complaint that may occur, such as something of courtesy or speeding or doing something that is not something that we would deem serious, then that is still documented. It is still handled by the divisional director or a district commander for that particular officer, and it is still processed through this through internal affairs, so it can be documented. So we, unlike a lot of other departments, may not necessarily have that same process, but I think that's important for us. So we make sure that we are monitoring our officers, both serious and even the non-serious complaints, in order for us to address those situations if necessary.
That idea of monitoring, I think, is very important. And I loved your distinction between what may be happening at our local area that is certainly more responsive than what one may be seeing or hearing about at a national level. But that kind of takes me to our next question, because I can't imagine what it must be like to be a police officer right now. I have, not dissimilar to you, lots of police officer friends. In fact, some that I have very deep relationships with, and we talk about these issues quite a bit. And we know this has been a very tumultuous year for policing. Some very tragic outcomes have resulted in interactions between civilians and police officers in our nation, and they've really ignited a firestorm of frequently justified anger. And sometimes the protests have been emotional but peaceful. Sometimes they've created skirmishes, and other times they've ended up building opportunities where violence has occurred, and we're seeing burnings and other things have happened where people have been injured or killed. And many deaths of multiple people in police custody: George Floyd, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, Eric Gardner, Tamir Rice, Philandro Castile, have drawn attention to the patterns that are not necessarily new, but that are being recorded and seen on video more often now. And this has created, I think, a groundswell of movement with elements that touch on race and gender and poverty. And at the end of that, at the root of it, really power.
Okay.
Can you tell us how it feels to be in a position such as your own and watching this historic moment that's occurring, where we're grappling, I think, with both the historical legacies of racism and how policing has figured in that, while at the
Mm.
same time having an environment where most police officers, I really believe, have the best interest of the community there, but they're oftentimes not seen through that lens by a public who's very concerned about power and how one uses that within
Right.
various communities.
I think it's this is a very important part, right, of where we are in our society, and where policing has a significant role, but that the ability of our police officers and the power that they have, that it requires officers to really understand their role in the community and how to try to come to some peaceful resolutions in many of our interactions, rather than creating what I call a moment. And all of those events that you have described, and the individuals who you have noted, again, and understanding the community's feeling about those incidents, particularly because they are persons of color, and historically what has occurred in our profession. This is something that I have been passionate about for really the entire part of my career. Is that that we have had to really try to find ways to change the culture of policing in many facets, in dealing with particularly the minority communities, in order to be able to better understand the things that have been impacted in history. And one of the things I always tell our officers is that if we really don't understand history, and how law enforcement has utilized as the oppressors, and over the past really 200 plus years of this country, and even longer. But when we even look at in most recent history, that has been utilized in many different facets. And we have to really be careful about sort of the idea that we're this occupying force when needed. Now, trust me, there are communities even here in Montgomery County, that probably need us the most, but they trust us the least. And that's been a huge undertaking for my police department and the law enforcement profession in general, is to be able to earn the trust of the police. And one of the ways I think that vitally that must happen in order for us to be able to overcome that is that we have to build relationships. And it's just like any relationship you have with either a coworker or a friend or even a family member. If you don't have a strong relationship, in order to build that trust and to know each other and to have conversations and courageous conversations about what's going on in our communities, then I think we'll always be one or two steps behind, if not further. And I think that is crucial in where we are. So it has been for me as a leader in this where we are in this time. It has been a very unique challenge for me. But I have, without any doubt, been willing to take on this challenge because I think this is the opportunity, maybe of the lifetime that I've been doing all of this work, and bringing my experience to have these courageous conversations with our community, and our community members. And I've developed some phenomenal relationships here in Montgomery County. I continue to get out, and unfortunately, COVID has sort of hampered that sort of outreach piece. But the ability to have Zoom calls and some virtual conversations over time has still benefited me, and I think in some regards the community, because we've been able to learn from each other. And I think that's what's important here, is that if we are able to basically let down these barriers that and take away our own personal biases about each other, and even if you have bad feelings towards the police, the ability to have a conversation that would be open-minded, I think lends us to an opportunity to be able to grow in this community for the better.
Hmm. I think one of the things that negates that, though, because I think your point is so powerful about understanding the historical context of policing within various communities, particularly communities of color, understanding that trust is something that oftentimes is perceived as needing to be earned rather than given outright, and that this unique moment of COVID, I think, gives us an opportunity to really sit down and pause to a certain extent that we can and really examine what's really happening. But the perception by the public, oftentimes, or at least portions of the public, is that everyone is being held accountable except the police. In
Right.
fact, one of our audience members posed the question. Glorianne Small said, why aren't cops being held accountable when they clearly are in the wrong when killing someone? There's always an excuse for bad behavior. What do you think is at the root of that? And in your mind, how do we start to respond to this perception that the blue wall protects its own, even when there is a wrong that has been done by a member of the police force?
So, and it's a great question, because I think again, there are a couple of factors here that I think that are important to highlight. One of the factors that I think it's important is that there is this in our criminal justice system, as as it is reviewed by state's attorneys, are the district attorneys who review police shootings. There is a decision that has to be made, and there are different processes all across this country. Every state has different processes within their state, or even sometimes in the as it relates to state law, about what are the standards that are held up for law enforcement. Now there is a federal standard that is established by the Constitution and the U.S. Supreme Court, about the officers, and again, when it comes to the deadly use of force, what allows them to do that. The objectively reasonable standard is put into that, and then your attorneys as well as your grand juries have to weigh that evidence based upon the totality of the circumstance. And I think sometimes we see situations that are put out there and the totality of the circumstance is not always laid out in some cases. But in some cases, I think our people have a certain way that they view law enforcement as a necessary, as you know, the necessity of their positions, and therefore they make these determinations that those actions by law enforcement are justified. And there are, you know, again, what's in, for example, you know, the standards are, for example, you utilizing force, deadly force, for example, means that you have to articulate that your life was in danger or another person's life was in danger. And outside of that, it means that the courts have to determine, or the judicial system has to determine whether or not your actions were clearly justified. And there have been some rulings that, you know, sometimes do not appear to be the way that I would think the public would accept that to be, because again, understanding a certain legal standard. When we talk about sort of the blue line, again, I think what is one of the game changers in our society has been the body-worn camera. Our department wears body-worn cameras. All of our patrol officers, not all of our officers wear them. In certain units, we have not gotten there yet, but we are increasing the utilization of cameras in many of our different units across the board. But I will say that I've got over 1,000 body-worn cameras that are issued to our officers. And I think that that has really changed the dynamic because you now see different views. And again, you know, one camera doesn't tell the whole story a lot of times. Sometimes we see multiple cameras. Seeing different views gives us a different perspective. And I think that's what's important that the public has to realize also, that we have to keep an open mind when we look at the different perspectives of how these incidents occur, and how, again, the camera is one part of evidence. There's other things that also go into consideration as a result. You know, for example, what did the officer see individually, and how he can or she can articulate that of what they saw in order to be able to articulate in their minds why they think that there was a justification for the force that they utilized. If they fail to meet that task, then absolutely that they should be held accountable for not utilizing the force, and not that they could have done something otherwise in order to be able to prevent that. We must understand, and this is one of the things that we highly emphasize, is really understand protecting life. That is our job. It is, no matter who we're dealing with, the sanctity of life is important on our department, and in the profession of law enforcement is something that we're talking about across all across this country, is understanding the need for our officers to do their very best in order to protect life, no matter the situation. But at the end of the day, we are sometimes put in very tough situations.
So one of the things I think is really interesting in this has been this perception about how police officers, or police unions in particular, oftentimes are seen as protecting their own. In fact, some would argue, regardless of the circumstances, the first statement that's out is that oftentimes by the police union, who's offering a perspective that is always in protection of the police officer. In fact, one of our audience members captured this when he said, Gus Griffin, doesn't the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights essentially give Maryland police an additional layer of due process rights not afforded to the average citizen? And is this law in general still needed? Can you talk a little bit about that and help me understand what's meant by this particular Bill of Rights, and how does that affect the relationship that police officers, or rather police chiefs, may have with their union disciplinary strategies, and how does this really, I think, impact that broader question about perceived accountability and trust with the community, and dare I even say trust within the police officers and the police units themselves.
Yeah, it's a very unique situation when you have police unions as well as here in Maryland the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights. And to answer the question, it does present a different situation, but I want to make sure that we understand there are two different dynamics here that we are working with. When we talk about, for example, like in a police involved shooting, there are two types of investigations that will be had. There will be a criminal investigation, and then there will be an administrative investigation by the department. Now, the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, it's primarily designed to deal with disciplinary issues for violations of administrative processes for these administrative hearings that we would have if we found an officer to do something of wrongdoing. So, for example, if there is an officer involved shooting that a state's attorney is looking at from the criminal aspect, the officer has the same rights and is protected by the Constitution, just like any citizen who would be under investigation for any potential criminal charge. So, for example, an officer is not obligated to provide a statement, not compelled to provide a statement of what has occurred. That officer has the right, example, to remain silent in that type of investigation. Now, the officer could volunteer, just like in any criminal investigation, where you will have people who will volunteer to give a statement. The officer could do that if they so chose, but the officer also has that right to remain silent. And the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights has nothing to do with that. What it does do, though, is for example, there are limitations. For example, if it's not a criminal investigation, the officer still has a right to be represented by an attorney in an administrative process, and the timeline is now 5 days from the actual event to be able to be compelled to give a statement or asked to give a statement. Again, if the officer is under criminal investigation or potential criminal charges, they may elect not to do so. But if it is just an administrative hearing, then it's generally for 5 days that they might be compelled to provide a statement. Now, the other part of this is there are rights that are given to an officer about the type of disciplinary hearing that the officer can choose. So there are options. So if you have an officer, for example, who is involved in a minor administrative charge, and that I present to the officer that I am going to take, for example, 3 days of pay of suspension for that particular officer. It's called summary punishment. So anything less than 3 days or less, or $150 fine, then the officer has the right to what they call a traditional hearing board. Now, that is a hearing board that is here in Maryland, that I, as the chief, our chiefs across the state of Maryland, would designate who would sit on that board. And one of those persons who would sit on that board would be an officer of equal rank. And then those charges would be basically levied, and the officer would have a hearing and have an attorney that will be provided by the union, and that the county would then proceed with proceed with the disciplinary process. And at the end of the day, I would have provided a disciplinary recommendation that would be upheld if the charges were upheld against that officer. There's another option that I think that some people are, have lots of concern about, and this is what they call an alternative hearing board. And this has gained a lot of attention across the country because this is something that is allowed in the Maryland Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights. Any county can allow for this to be a part of the collective bargaining process that we go through with our unions. So, for example, we do have an agreement with our FOP that allows for this process. And what this process does is very similar. It's that any sustained charges against an officer for any violation, but that the punishment exceeds that 3 day of suspension, or that the officer has the ability to select either the alternative hearing board or the traditional hearing board. The majority of the times they select the alternative hearing board, which is led by a neutral arbitrator who is really an arbitrator by trade, and that both parties agree to this individual, that is the union and the county. And then I would select one executive officer from my department to sit on that board, and then the union would select another individual from their membership to sit on the board, and then that particular case would then be presented to that board, and then they would make a determination on whether or not the charges were be upheld. If they uphold those charges, they do have the ability to either lessen the recommendation presented by myself as the chief, or to keep it the same. They generally will not go over my recommendation. So that has caused a little bit of concern by some of our community, because and across the country, in two places that have this, because they feel as if it takes away the chief's ability to maintain. For example, if I'm looking to dismiss an officer and this group comes back with a lesser penalty and the officer remains on the job, then that again can create some rifts that I think creates problems within our department based upon those recommendations. So it is a very there's going to be some interesting. I know it has been brought up in the Maryland State Legislature. There's a proposal to eliminate the Law and Officers Bill of Rights. There are some protections that I think that officers have the right to from a disciplinary process. But again, at the end of the day, we want to be fair and just no matter what, and when we handle our law enforcement officers as we deal with anything of allegations of wrongdoing.
So I think this is a very interesting conversation, because I do think that the public, in a lot of ways, has this perception that the due process rights are more clearly afforded to officers who are in these types of moments, as you call them, versus actually thinking about the due process and maybe at some point the rights of those folks who have somehow been aggrieved or killed or somehow affected in that moment. And I know locally, though, certainly we talk about what's happened in Maryland and the whole conversation about whether to repeal the Maryland Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights. Locally, though, we know that last year the Law Enforcement Trust and Transparency Act was signed by our county executive and requires an independent and transparent investigation of an officer involved death. Now, I think it may give the public some perception if they're able to see more thoughtfully and thoroughly what's happening, and introduces more objectivity into these cases. Do you think this is a step in the right direction, or do you think there's still some additional work that needs to be done to help, I think, bridge the gap between what the Police Officers Bill of Rights indicates and what this new responsive piece of legislation is, and actually where we might need to actually get to as a public. Do you see some direction that we need to be heading in?
Yeah, so I think that this was a step in the right direction, but I really feel strongly that I don't think it is the answer to what we need. I think this needs to go a bigger step forward, that the state really needs to take the responsibility of creating an independent investigative unit, you might say, in order to investigate these allegations of uses of force by law enforcement throughout the entire state of Maryland. And the reason why I'll just be real brief in this, the LET Act really requires the county executive and myself to find another law enforcement agency in the state of Maryland to come in and conduct our police involved shooting and deadly force cases. The problem with that is that there's really no stronghold on any other law enforcement agency in order to require them to do that.
Right.
And so when you have
There's nothing to
something,
compel them to participate. Is that what you're
right,
saying?
exactly,
Gotcha.
yeah.
Okay.
So I've already inquired with several police chiefs in the state of Maryland to discuss this. Right, it's like what would require me to have them provide me with several investigators from their police departments to actually come and handle a very lengthy investigation, because these investigations are not simple, right? It requires a lot of man hours and cooperation. And again, from a law enforcement perspective, we are the fact finders. We are not the determiners of fact at the end of the day. That is required by the state's attorney's office. Now, what I will say that I think is in the right direction is that our state's attorney's office our state's attorney, John McCarthy, has an agreement, a memorandum of understanding with the Howard County State's Attorney's Office to actually have all of our cases reviewed by Howard County to take away the possibility of bias that some may see due to the fact that our officers work with some of our state's attorneys on a regular basis. And so I think that has been something that is, and if it was, in fact, it was pointed out in President Obama's 21st Century Policing Commission, the recommendations that they made. And I think that's been very fruitful to this point. But I think we still have to go a step further. And I think there's talk in the legislature. I don't know, how advanced they are moving on this, but I think it's something that in the near future that this is where we need to be. I mean, there are other states that have a model behind it. It's just going to take our legislatures to make some courageous movement on this, because I think this would then help to create, again, whether it's from a perception standpoint or to provide that trust in the community, that each case is being looked at independently and without any biases.
I can imagine that as a police chief, trying to balance these multiple demands for calls for greater accountability and transparency, while at the same time trying to maintain the morale of police officers who oftentimes feel that they're being maligned in the public space, trying to respond to the anxious needs and calls by legislators who are oftentimes at conflict, even in your example of describing what you may see at the local level versus the state versus the federal, all the various associations that represent the interest of civilian and the public, as well as representing the interest in perspective of law enforcement, I think about how challenging that might be to maintain a certain energy and vibrancy amongst your officers, both those who are commissioned and those who support them. I think a lot about what it must feel like to have to recruit officers to step into this space and to do this work in this moment right now. Uh, how do you approach this work? And have you seen this current environment that we're in, this kind of maddening ecosystem where all of these calls for justice and for accountability and transparency at the same time, calls for safety and greater engagement around community policing? All of them take place in trying to maintain a vibrant workforce at the end of the day. How do you balance that as a chief? And do you see any challenges immediately or even into the future as you think about how you go about recruiting and maintaining effective police officers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it is, I tell you, one of my, I guess, what has given me tremendous heartburn and a lack of sleep has been trying to keep the morale of my officers at a level that I think that, gives them the pride that they need to do the work every day. But in the midst of a lot of these discussions and a lot of the rhetoric, and there's a lot that's out there on social media. There's been a lot of things going on across, for example, in Montgomery County, even here in the state of Maryland, that have equated a lot of the incidents that have occurred in other parts of the country. And now it is like our officers, in some cases, they feel as if they have been demonized to be lesser than human in many regards by some of our community members. And I think that has been something that has been at the forefront of how I have had to lead this department to maintain some sense of professionalism in a way that boosts their morale, to maintain and keep them going on a day by day basis. I highlight, on many occasions, just the work that they do on a daily basis, that they continue to strive, regardless of what may be the national outcry or even locally. And I think they see things are out there often. And what I don't sometimes hear is what I call the silent majority. Those are our
Yes.
community members who actually support what our officers are doing and providing the safety in their particular communities. And so we don't necessarily hear from them much. And I remind our officers that I clearly know that they're there. I mean, I receive a lot of emails and calls and letters from many community members that support our officers. And I really try to make sure that they are receiving those messages. From the recruitment standpoint, and again, this is something I think that a lot of police chiefs are concerned about, is like, what is this going to look like moving forward when, would an individual really want to join law enforcement in the midst of what we are going through? I will tell you, I have been pleasantly surprised. Not that we've been struggling with recruitment over the past few years, but I've been pleasantly surprised recently that we still have people that are really interested in this job. And I think many of them, like I said, are in it for the right reason. They want to be a game changer. And I think that, this is an opportunity, right? This is an opportunity for people who really want to make a difference in the community. Law enforcement will be somewhat different. I see that. And I think, but at the end of the day, we'll have a mission. But it allows for those who can bring something different. I mean, diversity is utilized on this department in many different ways. And the ability, particularly in our community, to have bring in people who bring different assets to our agency and to this county speaks volumes. And I'm beginning to see some of that. And I think that that still brings some encouragement and enlightening for me, if we can continue that, telling that story, but I think that again, we have to understand what is law enforcement going to look like, and is that something that people really want to be a part of? But there are so many opportunities in the profession that I think that we have to keep our minds open to understand that there is an opportunity here for us to have a very positive outcome of bringing people that will do us really well here. And one of the things I've really been driving home, and I want to thank Montgomery College for as a partner in this, is that we have been really working towards even getting homegrown people here in the county and nearby who really want to be in this profession. And we're starting to see the growth in that. I mean, I just the other day, not only as police officers in the recent academy that we just started earlier this summer, but I was just with my dispatchers who are a vital part of our department, and I was just amazed that probably 90% of the new class is from Montgomery County, and that's something we haven't seen in a while. So that to me, that's exciting, right? And that we shouldn't take that for granted. To see that diversity, and particularly to see our homegrown folks who really still want to be a part of this team.
You said something a little while ago that really struck me about the silent majority of folks who are, and what I find to be so interesting is that we have managed to allow support of policing to be bifurcated. Either you're for police or you're
Right,
anti-police, where the clear majority of people are actually somewhere in between. I
right,
think that where you may have the silent majority who are very much in support of what policing is and what good policing looks like, I think oftentimes the trust factor breaks down, in that at the same time, I think that the typical civilian also wants to hear when there's bad policing occurs that good police speak to that and they
right,
talk about it. And I think that to me is where that dissonance oftentimes occurs. And therefore, it puts that bridge or maybe that distance there that doesn't allow us to really bridge together to say, okay, what should good policing look like in our communities? How can we build homegrown talent that understands and values who this community, who our communities are, because we have multiple communities within one, both macro and micro, and at the same time wanting to be a part of the solution. And I think a lot about that because when I talk with, as you know, a number of your um, officers I've had the privilege of working with who are off
hmm,
duty. I also work with a number of your retired officers who are very dear to me. That it strikes me is that when I have these deep personal conversations with them, that's not the public voice that I hear oftentimes, that it stands out when we hear about the rank and file talking about what they see and hear in these videos, those moments that you describe. and
right,
and that takes me then to my next question, Chief. I think a lot, as you know, I have a 13-year-old son,
hmm,
and I think the struggle of every Black mother is at some point, and Black father for that matter, having the talk with their child
right,
about the relationship they should have with police officers to understand the broader context. And my son, as you know, last year experienced even some violence that was not, and the police were so
hmm,
wonderful in helping us navigate that experience. I, I would love to hear from you when we think about those names that I called earlier, when I think about the phenomenal police officers that you do have, when I think about the incidences of police violence that are occurring in our country, when I hear and think about the various legal realities that are here and all the things you've talked about to this point, how do I talk to my son about his relationship with policing? How do I counsel him about his interactions with police? Because right now, I want him to have a profound respect. I want him to have a profound appreciation for people who have said they will protect and serve him and who will
right,
work to do that. At the same time, in the back of my mind, I'm also thinking about how I need him to be prepared as he is a 13-year-old who looks 16, who's filling
Hmm.
out, who is
Right.
all the things that you and I both know that we have to have these conversations about.
Yeah.
What types of things do you think I should be talking to him about in terms
Right.
of his interactions with police? And not even just me, I'll
Right.
even just say as parents would have with their children right now.
Yeah, and Dr. Pollard, that's a phenomenal question. I mean, it's something that a question I hear often, almost daily, if not weekly. And I will tell you, I will share with you a conversation I had with my son. As my son was going through his high school years and even in college, and even being the son of a police officer.
Mhm.
But I think it's vitally important, no matter what, whether the advice came from me as a police officer or me as just without that job title, but just as dad, to get him to understand that your interaction with the police, you have to be really to the understanding of what is that officer concerned about when he's dealing with you, whether it's a traffic stop or whether he's just stopping you on the street asking for your identification. And at the end of the day, the one thing I would just say is to my son, and I would say to your son, is just do what the officer is asking you to do. And even if you think that the officer is outside of the realm of their authority at that particular time, there are options, right? One of the first things I always told my son was, you can't win an argument on the street.
Mm.
You're not going to win that argument. That's not the time or the place. So if you are getting a speeding ticket and you didn't think you were speeding, at the end of the day, that's the place to have that debate is going to be in the court. So even if he's accused you of doing something wrong, that is not the time or the place to do that. But I think that there are a lot of great interactions that I see with our officers. And again, I know people can get emotional, right? There is sometimes a fear. I share this with people. I said, look, I grew up as a young Black man, no doubt in my lifetime, and have been stopped by the police.
Mm.
And I understand what that fear is, right? Nobody likes that interaction, right? But at the end of the day, whether I'm in a car, it's at night. I always share with folks is that officers want to feel safe, right? They don't. If this is the first time of an interaction meeting you, we don't know who you are, as well as you may not know who we are.
Mm.
But at the end of the day, if it's you're being stopped at night, for example, in a car, what makes me feel safe as a police officer is that I can see you. Let's say you stop, you turn your interior light on in your car. Your hands are visible where I can see them. And then if I ask for your license and registration, those are the things that I just want to be able to see and be comfortable with that. I tell people, if you have dark tinted windows in your car, it might be a good idea to let the windows down, right? As the officer approaches, because that again, that will lower the temperature, right? If I could say that in that interaction. And so it's just about a moment. I think that we all teach, with our children, is just to have is any interaction you have with someone from authority, you are going to answer the questions and not, be as truthful as possible. And I will tell you, the majority of those interactions go completely fine. And generally, and then again, if there is an issue with the officer about being discourteous or treating someone with disrespect and anything beyond that, that they should no doubt complain to that officer's supervisor as soon as possible. And in fact, if there's things that are happening on our streets, we say that you have the right to call a supervisor to the scene. So we want to make sure people understand that there are these options, But again, I think sometimes we find in our society, sometimes people try to do a little bit too much. And, again, we have officers, again, who we have seen who will sometimes go outside of their authority. And we look to address those issues as quickly as possible. But in order for us to be able to do that, it does require for folks to let us know about these types of events. But I just say to you, Dr. Pollard, that I'm sure you are raising a tremendous young man who is going to be a great contributor, if not already, doing some great things in our community. And I'm sure he is. That you will give him the direction that he needs, right, to understand that when dealing with law enforcement, talk to the officer, see that his name, hey, Officer Jones, so he knows the officer's name, and just be willing to provide him with the information that they're requesting for whatever reason. Ask him why is he being stopped if that is it, and he has every right to do that, and the officer should be providing him with that answer. And I think that the cooperation is that doing the best you can to cooperate will probably make the interaction a lot smoother than not.
I think that idea, and as you capture this idea of the attempting to de-escalate situations in the midst of that, is something that I think I've seen a lot of police officers deploy those strategies on campus when I've observed those interactions. When I done my own police interactions, there's always been this effort, I think, to try and do that, and I think that really becomes very pivotal right now when we look at the rising incidents of police interactions with those who have mental illnesses. And I
Right.
think that that continues to be one of the more defining issues of this moment that we're seeing. There have been several cases in Montgomery County in the last couple of years in which it appears to be that the mental capacity of the civilian was in question. And there's been a couple of cases, 2020 and 2018 in particular. And I know that the officers were cleared of wrongdoing in both of those cases, but handling of civilians and mental health crises will probably always be a part of police officers' duties. And one police officer, I think oftentimes in these moments are trying to figure out how to grapple with that. Can you talk a little bit about how police officers are trained to de-escalate, and where are the gaps that we need to work on in order to do greater work in this space?
During my 35-year career, I will tell you, we are handling more mental health cases than I have ever seen. And we get these calls on a daily basis. And then there are times that I clearly know that we shouldn't be going to this particular call, right? That this is not
Mhm.
the type of call that we need to encounter. And so what we are currently doing is working in regards to sort of this reimagining public safety, of a refocus of us trying to find in the county government, not just the police department, but county government, a better way to respond to some of these cases of people going through mental health crisis. Now, as it relates to the police officers, currently we have what we call our crisis intervention training. And that has a mental health component. It's additional to what our baseline of our police recruits get. It is additional training, 40 hours, that are officers that we really were just focusing on our patrol officers who were going to be issued tasers, were actually required to go through this training, particularly deal with to help to identify individuals who go through these types of mental health crises. We work with Health and Human Services, their crisis behavioral units. We have a clinician who actually goes, and I have a crisis intervention team that is small in nature, but who will deal with a lot of these types of calls that we, the police, regularly get engaged in order to help people get the help that they need. But now what we've done is we are requiring every one of our officers to go through this additional crisis intervention training in order to give them better tools to be able to deal with individuals that go through crisis. And again, as we talk about de-escalation, one of the things we try to really focus on is not creating a moment, and trying to really minimize our interactions with individuals that might be going through these crises in order to be able to get help in some regards. Now, part of the challenge with this still had the individual who goes through this crisis still plays a role in how we as the police handle it. But it's our role to be able to try to create space and try to get time and distance as we go through this. And we've had a lot of successes that don't always get highlighted out in the media. But we have had some tremendous successes with individuals that hasn't warranted any use of force, and we've been able to get the people the help that they need. One of the other things that I have just brought to our department, and it is a training that the Police Executive Research Forum brought in. It's called ICAT training. It's particularly involving individuals who are going through some sort of again mental health crisis and suicidal, and that they actually want to commit suicide by cop. They want the police officers to actually take their lives because of what they're going through. But again, we are trying to in that preservation of life, trying to come up with new strategies. And this training will allow our officers to come up with new strategies in order to be able to take away that individual who wants to have the so-called suicide by cop, in order to be able to get that individual the help they need without having to utilize any sort of deadly force on that individual, just because that's what they want. Every situation can't be looked upon the same. That's why we train our officers in so many different facets of in that regard. But this training, I think, will be a great plus for our department, and I'm hoping to see some great successes with that as well, to have another tool on our tool belt to help with our community, particularly those who suffer in mental crisis.
What struck me as I listened to your response, Chief, was this whole issue of training and how it is so essential, not just the initial training that police officers may have, but this kind of ongoing training that responds to the environment that we're in. Very compelling, your observation about the rise of mental health crises that police officers are seeing. I think about that. I think about certainly a numbers of folks who over time we may be seeing other types of contextual environmental changes that may well be something that police officers would need to be much more intentionally trained around. Implicit bias, I know we'll come to that in a moment, but this you raise this question about use of force, which I think is a really powerful one. And we had an audience member pose this question and said, quote, one of the things that I have noticed is that when police have shot and killed persons, even if it was deemed justified, the police fired multiple shots even after they already hit the person. Would it be preferable for officers to fire only once or twice instead of unloading their weapon? This will reduce the chance of a mistake of judgment that will cause death unnecessarily. Again, another training aspect I imagine is in here, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about this particular Jonathan's question about the use of force.
The use of force, right? When an officer decides to pull the trigger of their weapon, their handgun, particularly, that they have decided that this individual has either is a threat to themselves or to another, from a standpoint of deadly force. And it is the ultimate decision that they've made at this particular time. The way we train is for the fact that in the case of utilization of deadly force, It's not the fact that we are shooting to kill, we are shooting to stop the threat. And there are known cases that we have all throughout policing that officers can fire, maybe one or two shots, and it doesn't stop the threat. Even individuals that are sometimes struck can still overcome being shot for the moment and still continue with a so-called attack. So with that being said, that's why again we try to make sure that we're not utilizing excessive force. We're monitoring each of those shootings to make sure the officer doesn't go outside of the realm of what we train. And again, we are making sure that that officer, when making that decision, which is it's a tough decision that our officers when they have to decide to pull that trigger. That is not something we go to work every day expecting to do. Again, I've been on this job for 35 years, and one of the things I'm blessed to be able to say is I have not been placed in a situation where I've had to actually pull the trigger to shoot anyone. And the majority of our police officers go through an entire career, 25 plus years, and they never get involved in a police-involved shooting. There's a very small percentage of our officers that are put in that predicament. But at the end of the day, we have to train and be prepared, for any worst case scenario. But again, we want to make sure our officers are staying within, and we train to this every year. Officers come, they have to qualify with their weapons each and every year. And we put them through certain scenarios. And if we feel as if they are failing that scenario-based training by, for example, even in a training mode that they're actually shooting unarmed people or people who may be posing as if they have a weapon but they don't, then we have to do remedial training to make sure that we're making sure that those officers are meeting the standards that we have set, to make sure that the standards are met and that they are going to be capable of doing the job when we put them on the street each and every day.
I think that's such a provocative thing to think about, because oftentimes I think so much of the public has, television police shows in their mind where police officers fire their weapons on folks all the time, and they're perpetually having to justify, whether it be with their commanding officers, the civilian review board, legal system, that they use that force justifiably. So it would then beg then that, though, because the actual incidents or hopeful incidents of this should be fairly low, that when you have a police officer that has multiple or the potential for multiple interactions where they may have to use a higher standard of force in their interactions, it might be a clear indication that there's need for some remediation with training, some interventions that oftentimes the public may or may not be aware of, but should they be aware of? Because I think that's the
Right.
other issue oftentimes that plays in here when you think about your point about the moments. We all know about the moments. We don't know about the moments that don't become moments.
Right.
So, what plays in our conscience, whether it be the moments we see in real life or the moments we see played out in fictionalized television or movies, I think profoundly influences the way we think about the relationship that we have with police. Do you think that the public, and you see a big movement happening for civilian review boards?
Mhm.
Interested in, because oftentimes the perception is that police are policing their own, and
Right.
oftentimes the perceptions that bias is there. Do you think that that civilian review boards have a role, and should they be more thoughtfully used within local and state police efforts?
Yeah, one of the things I think, Dr. Pollard, I think would be a bonus for this community would be to add civilians to our existing review boards,
Mm.
because I think it would be an opportunity to provide some additional accountability. I think it's important because um, to have a part of this, because you still have officers who, again, who are doing the job and who understand the dynamics of the profession. But I think that the citizens also bring a different view and should have some input. But I think that's important. I mean, I think, one of the things I've also stated that I think would be beneficial in this world of accountability is for the fact that we would have, you know, when officers are when charges are sustained of wrongdoing, that there would be some openness to allowing that to be demonstrated to the public. And now, personnel files protect that. And I understand that. I mean, everybody's personnel file, no matter what job you do, nobody's
Right.
personnel file is open to the public, right? But I think that in certain cases, for example, use of force, there are certain charges that I think that that the public has a right to know about, whether or not an officer has been convicted before or had charges sustained against them for certain things. I think that that could be fair and just, and as long as it's utilized in a way that it's not just that an officer is accused of such, but that charges have been sustained on that officer. Because I think there's sometimes we do, and I will say there are times we get frivolous complaints about our officers, and when investigations are done, we see that the things that have been reportedly stated that occurred did not occur. So that's so again, if those charges would be sustained, I would be in full support to have that as a matter of accountability, and to actually gain part of the public's trust in regards to seeing those officers that they feel as if there might be a problem in our communities.
Let me ask you a question about cultural competence. We've talked quite a bit
Mm,
about training here, and I would imagine we think about the glorious diversity of Montgomery County. You
mhm.
talked earlier about the need in having a police force that reflects that diversity, understands it, has an intimacy and the knowledge of how to respond and understand some of the challenges and the joy of living and working in a community as diverse as Montgomery County. What is the role of cultural competence training as a part of the work that police officers experience on a regular basis? Is there implicit bias training? And while we also have the rank and file engaged, hopefully, in that type of training, do we also require that same training of leadership, executive leadership as well?
Yeah, as someone who has taken a keen interest in something that's very near and dear to my heart, cultural competence training is vitally important in this profession. We have, over the years of my career, it has been attempted in many different ways. And never to say one way is better than the other, but I think it plays a significant role, particularly in Montgomery County, because we are such a diverse community. I mean, the reality is, if we look at community policing and a lot of the things of engagement, and we have of the diversity that we have not only in our culture of race, but also when we look at religion, and we look at generational differences. We look at a lot of different aspects of cultural competency that we think is vitally important for our officers, because no matter where you come from, everybody needs to be exposed. I try to, one of the things I tell my officers all the time, I'm always learning about a new culture. I mean, this county is just, it's phenomenal in so many ways, and I
Yes.
learn from different people, and it really broadens your awareness, and that's one of the things that we want our officers to understand, is that okay, you may not completely understand every culture, but at least you're aware of it, right? You're aware of a religion, some of their practices and concerns that they have. And particularly, we look at some communities where law enforcement is looked at in a different way from the communities in which they come from. I mean, in some countries, they are very militaristic in the
Mm.
standpoint the military is their police, and it has a very negative impact in their communities, and even worse than what we may be describing here today about perception, right? But the reality is that we've seen where there's been barriers of communication, people's fear for calling 911 or even getting the police involved in public safety concerns about whether it's domestic violence. So we have to make sure our officers are aware of that. And we also have to, I think when officers are really aware of how people can sometimes react to situations such as like we talked about with your son as an African American, understanding, where what are the stories that you educated your son about, right? And that's resonating in his mind. And one of the things I've always taught to our officers about is about understanding why do African Americans feel as if when you pull them over that they think that you pulled them over simply because they were black, right? And to me there's a history component to that. And I've shared my own feelings about that with our officers. And so from that standpoint, it's vitally important that we have that training. Implicit bias training is also something that has been embedded in our department over the past few years. Our Maryland Training Police Commission requires that our departments go through implicit bias training. And we have really embraced that. I think that is something that continues to grow. Again, there's a lot of legislation centered around it, but we're already ahead of that. But we still need to maintain that proficiency in our agency as we go through time, because again, I don't care where you come from, I don't care what you look like. You can talk, we say this all the time. We tell our folks, you can say all the time that, oh, I'm not biased against this group. We all have our biases, right? And
Yes, we
this
do.
implicit bias training helps us to bring out those biases in order for you to provide the best service possible to our community members. And that's something that I focus on. And as it relates to our police leadership, absolutely. I mean, that is something, again, me as a champion for all of this. I remember when Chief Manger was here, and again, only due to COVID, but we actually took down our entire police executive team, leadership team, to the African American, the National African American Museum in Washington D.C. And I will tell you, it was an eye-opening experience for many of the executives that participated. We had some great discussion as a result of it. We've taken our police recruit classes down outside of the COVID pandemic, of course. And those who have not had the opportunity, we will do our very best to get them down there. We take every recruit class to the Holocaust Museum as well,
Mm.
because again, there are lessons. Remember, as I talked about history lessons
Yes,
that could
sir.
be repeated, right? If we don't really know our history, that how law enforcement played such a role in that horrible part of our history. And so that's why those two museums, I think, highlight really some significant parts of policing in our agency and in our profession that our folks need to be acutely aware of. Again, about wearing a badge and a uniform and how that impacts people's lives outside of what you may think. And I can promise you, it is mostly different than what a lot of people think in that regard, if you're not aware.
I love your conversation about what people bring with them about their perceptions because and their experiences culturally. I often talk to our folks at the college about the same thing about how people perceive college. In some cultures, in some countries, college is seen as the other, as for the elite. They don't believe that
Mhm.
higher education should be accessible. They question the admission practices based on what they see in other experiences. So I so appreciate that recognition of how cultural differences impact impact not only the perceptions, but their interactions. And a lot of that is so historically ingrained. The visit to those museums and processing of that historically, I think, is so important. I have a question from the audience, came from Eric Sterling, and Eric asked a question about marijuana. The ACLU identified marijuana arrest as a major source of racial bias in its July 2020 report, A Tale of Two Countries, Racially Targeted Arrests in the Era of Marijuana Reform. First, what explanation is there for the police in one of the most progressive jurisdictions in the state to make a disproportionate fraction of the state's arrest for marijuana possession? And second, given the lethality of the opioid epidemic, why are police making marijuana enforcement a higher priority than opioid trafficking enforcement?
So there's a couple of dynamics here. The When we talk about marijuana possession, what we first must understand is that marijuana is no longer criminalized from a possession standpoint in the state of Maryland. And so when you're saying that we are arresting people for marijuana possession, that's misleading. And it's misleading because marijuana it's been decriminalized. It is now a civil citation, and it is just a civil fine, and there is no arrest record for anyone who is now stopped for the possession of marijuana. So I think that those numbers are again, marijuana is still embedded in our community deeply in many facets. Now, one of the questions that was asked was simply, why do we focus and why is a large number of those cases occurring here in Montgomery County? Well, first of all, Montgomery County has 1.1 million people that live here, not including those who visit Montgomery County. So all of the individuals that we might be citing for marijuana doesn't always live here in the county. And we have the largest population of any jurisdiction in the state of Maryland. So when you look at a proportional measure, you're looking at dealing with more people in the county. One of the things that I will tell you that is disturbing to me, first and foremost, in Montgomery County, is the violence that we have seen that has been associated with the distribution of marijuana in Montgomery County. What many don't see is that we have had individuals who are committing armed robberies, who are doing home invasion robberies of individuals who are involved in the marijuana distribution and large possessions of marijuana, and people have been seriously injured. And I will tell you, in the past 5 years plus, all of our drug-related homicides have all centered around marijuana. Now,
Wow.
for me, but I think that that's a matter of concern that people need to be aware of, is that there is significant violence connected to this drug network, and so we will focus on this because of the violence associated with it. That is something we can't ignore. Compare this to the opioid epidemic, which is in many facets has a different dynamic to it. We pay specific and have specific concerns about the opioid epidemic. But again, a lot of the opioid distribution is done very secretly. Individuals are not utilizing this drug on our streets, such as it's harder to detect. Marijuana is easier. We find it in possession in many other types of investigations that we do, that individuals might be arrested for other offenses, and we're finding marijuana, so that is being dealt with. But the opioid distribution is a focus, particularly at a distribution. But what we do know opioids is the fact that many of them, such as heroin, don't even come from Montgomery County. They come from some of our larger cities, such as Baltimore, which is one of our points of main distribution sites in the state of Maryland that us also impact here in Maryland. So we work
Mhm.
with our federal partners to work with those distribution impacts, but there's also other facets of the opioid market that deal with prescription drugs and others that are also being illegally sold on our streets that we have to do different types of investigations for. But that's something that we have grave concerns about. But again, as I noted, that I want to make sure that people understand that marijuana has, unfortunately, has this violence piece to it that we simply cannot ignore.
Yeah, what I loved about your response there is demonstrating the complexity of the issue. Certainly, it's not that marijuana is the target, it is all of the things that go around marijuana with the violence and the culture and the transactions that have actually become more problematic. Another question that came from the audience came from a Denise Matheny, and she says, what are your thoughts on the defund police movement? Don't the police actually need additional funding for educational programs and incentive programs as tools to diversifying and improving community trust?
Yes, and thank you, Denise, for this question. I am totally opposed to the funding dialogue that many people are having, and I just so everyone understands that what's mostly important for people to realize is that 83% of our budget is goes to our personnel and personnel costs and benefits for all of our employees. What is missing is the fact that that means that 17% goes to the operational cost of our department. So currently we are challenged, and I will tell you, I think education is a vital part of our police department. Training is vitally important. And if we are not focusing on training and providing our officers with the best training available, we will be falling short. I think any department that's a well-trained department is an excellent police department. And then when you divest in training, then I think the community is going to suffer as a result of that, as well as those officers from getting the additional experience that they need.
Mhm. Do you, when you hear the phrase defund the police, do you think that the phrase itself is misleading? Because at least in my understanding of what this particular movement is about, it is really trying to offer, I think, two perspectives. One is that the underfunding of all of those support services that you talked about earlier are necessary, particularly grappling with issues of mental health, grappling with issues of poverty that we see, oftentimes issues of substance abuse that are happening, and that as a public, we have asked the police to step
Mhm.
in and be social service agencies in large parts rather than being police agencies. So to me, it's a false bifurcation, but we've put this up here to say defund the police as a way of people hearing that, oh, we want to say, don't give the police the appropriate resources they need for staffing or for training purposes, versus actually arguing that we've over demanded from police, and might I even say from education, in the
Right.
K-12 space particularly, over demanded of them to do the work of community service and social service agencies without appropriate funding, which oftentimes may lead to these breakdowns in community trust when they have these incidents of interactions where there was very clear opportunity that had there been a clearer partnership with social service agencies, we may very well have had an opportunity to reverse that moment as you described. How do we problematize, at least in my mind, or give context to this phrase of defund? Because I would agree with you, none of us would have issue or interest in saying fewer police officers, less training for them, less support services that are necessary. But how do we also respond to those folks who are saying, hey, we're asking police to do things that they weren't, shouldn't be expected to do. And oh, and by the way, we're underfunding the folks who actually should step in the cut and help support the police to do the work we need them to be doing.
Dr. Paula, I think you're spot on. I think what you have described is exactly that. I do not think that the definition for defunding the police is clearly defined. But I think the reality is correct, is that that we should be that there should be a focus on providing that reallocation of resources. There are lots of demands that our community has that I could reallocate those officers to and be more proficient. We're living in a very complex society these days, right? When we talk about the different types of crimes and crime victims that we have on a daily basis, and the needs that we have to try to do our very best to fulfill, the void of those individuals who have been victimized, and whether it's been our seniors with fraud and cybersecurity that goes across it goes across the county in many different facets. We could expand in many different areas, such as domestic violence, our sexual assault investigators that I need more of, unfortunately, due to the increase of that particular crime. So to take away from us, and again, one of the things I want to point out to our community is that we have 1,300 officers for 1.1 million people. We have the lowest officer to citizen ratio, one of the lowest across this country. But what I'm proud about, right, is the fact that our crime rate is low, but understand our community still is growing, but our police department is not growing at that same rate. So that gives me pause, because that means that more of our officers are carrying a load of workload. And when you carry a heavier workload, as you know, Dr. Pollard, then are you going to be as proficient in handling our community complaints as you could be? And I want to make sure that we're giving our community, no matter who you are, the best service possible that we can provide from a public safety standpoint. And so that's something that our community also needs to understand, that, okay, you might be taking away something from one part of our department, but somebody else is going to suffer as a result thereof. And that's something I think we have to really give that some serious thought that could be an unintended consequence.
So perhaps we need to be able to hold two thoughts in our mind at the same time: adequately fund those folks who have been charged with and volunteer and are paid to serve and protect, and also adequately fund those folks who are there also to help and serve and protect the community who are not in policing. And I think the dilemma we've crafted in some of the language is a suggestion that we can only do one thing at a time. I think as a community, we have to expect that we're doing more of that in both fronts. Chief Jones, you have been so generous with your time. And as I'm looking at this, I'm impressed that you've answered all these questions for me. You've been so thoughtfully engaged. You haven't had one sip of water. You haven't looked at your phone. You haven't done anything. And I want to bring it to a close by giving you an opportunity to dream and message. When you think about what you want to see happen in Montgomery County, and think about the police department that you lead and the community of which you are a member of, and certainly think about the future and all the challenges that are out there that we've talked about, but also all the joys of being a member of this community. I'd love to give you an opportunity to end in a way that is not the way that I had originally planned. I want to give you an opportunity to dream a little bit. What's the message that you, as a professional who's been doing this work for over 35 years, who's been deeply connected with this community in multiple ways, who was influenced by his father, to step into this work, whose brother said, "Hey, come check out Montgomery County." And you got to see this. When you think about that, what is your hope and what's the message that you would like to leave this interview with, telling our viewers in Montgomery County and even those broader about why you do this work and what you hope to see for this community?
So thank you, Dr. Pollard, for this opportunity. I mean, and thanks for allowing me to share here. I I must go back to like when I was 21 years old, moving here to Montgomery County, and the really just the enthusiasm I had about coming to a community that I thought was just very progressive, from a standpoint of the different cultures and the opportunities that were provided to me. I will tell you, having who has had the opportunity to raise my family here in Montgomery County, my wife and I have had some tremendous opportunities to meet some of the most fabulous people I could have ever imagined meeting and working with, and sharing experiences and raising children and all of the like, through my lifetime. But and in the midst of my career, and I look at what that over those 35 years, I really think about um, that bright spot that was there when I first came here,
Mm.
and what I thought about Montgomery County, and I still think about it today. I mean, we still have an opportunity to bring even greater greatness. I mean, Montgomery County wasn't perfect when I got here. It's not perfect today. The police department, right, is not perfect, right, and it wasn't perfect when I got here. I mean, there have been some significant changes. When I came here, there were 75 black officers. The first black officer was hired in 1968.
Wow.
And there were some significant challenges. And there has been to grow the diversity in this police department, not just with African American officers, but with other officers of color. I've seen a tremendous growth of women in this profession in Montgomery County. I remember how I could see how women were treated when I first arrived here. And now the way I see women who are treated on this department today, who have a significant role and opportunities that weren't always there. So what that tells me is that there's hope, right? There's this hope that we have in our future, that one of my best friends says, I want to leave this better than I found it. And that's my hope as well, is that I'm in a place that I can have the opportunity, and I have the opportunity to help our department educate our community, as well as continue to be educated by our community on the needs of the community, the desires of the community as a collective front, and that we are all open-minded to share, to talk, to listen, and communicate in an effective manner to bring the best of the best for our young people, for our elders, for the senior community, for everyone, to live in a safe community and feel that they can trust the officers that are coming to provide the service for them, and everyone is treated equally. So that's my hope. I believe that we can get there. We are all from the human race. There are challenges. There will continue to be challenges, but I ask for everyone's patience in our regard as we move towards this, and that we continue to do the very best we can to bring about this change that we seek, and always for the better. So again, Dr.
Mm.
Pollard, thank you for that opportunity.
Oh, thank you, Chief Jones. I'm going to tell you a little secret. When I was 17, actually, I take that back, 14, I had the opportunity to be a part of a Police Explorers when I was a freshman, I believe it was in high school. And I have always had a profound respect for police officers and the work they do because I felt that then, and I believe that now, that ultimately a civilized community and a civilized nation needs healthy police officers, healthy in the broadest sense, that they have a deep commitment to the communities they serve. They believe deeply in the potential and the power and the hope of what that means for their community. And if we do it very, very well, we have police officers who are a part of the community that they serve. They're committed to that community, and there's ultimately a trusting relationship. I still believe that, and I have that hope renewed every time I have the opportunity to interact and talk with my local police officers. I think it's very interesting, kind of like Congress. Everybody hates Congress, but they love their congressman or their local person. I think there's some of that that also happens with police right now. I think the reality is a lot of us have the macro narrative of policing as they see now, but when they think about what's happening in their local communities, far from perfect, certainly an opportunity for still growth and development. But when they know and talk with their local police officers, as I've had the opportunity to talk with our chief of police today, I feel so grateful to continuously live in a community like Montgomery County. I want to thank you for your time and energy in this rich discussion. I learned so much and had the opportunity to really hear a depth to your responses, for which I'm grateful. I also want to thank the Meyer Foundation for their support of our series and their continued belief that having these types of conversations in the public makes us better. I also believe that their vision for equity and racial justice in our diverse community is one of which Montgomery College benefits from. I want to thank our media sponsor, Bethesda Beat, for their partnership of many years. And thank you for the editor and publisher of Bethesda Magazine, Steve Hull, for his collaboration. He is certainly a wonderful friend of ours. We are so grateful for the way in which they help us amplify this message and take it out to the public as a whole. I want to thank some of my favorite people at Montgomery College, MCTV, for all of their work on this event and all the things they do behind the scene to make this ready. And for all of you who are watching, including the illustrious, incomparable Dr. Megan Gibbons, who makes this better for me each and every time. I hope that you all enjoyed the experience today. The theme of the larger dialogue series this year is building racial justice, and we'll be exploring a number of different lenses throughout the year. The college is honored and proud to be a site of complex dialogue and the exchange of civil ideas. We believe that we're made better when we have a robust and responsive democracy. Thank you all so much. Thanks again, Chief Jones, for being here. And I look forward to seeing you next time on the Presidential Dialogue Series. Take care and be well.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you.